Um, when I've been asked to come and talk to you about my experiences during the war, I accepted it willingly without any reservations. Also, I want you to know that it is very painful for me to talk about what has happened in the various concentration camps through which I lived through. When I came to this wonderful country of ours, the only thing I wanted to do is forget what happened to me. I was fortunate to be able to meet a lovely young American girl, married her, started my business and a family. I wanted to blend in, became American citizens within 2 years. I wanted to be one of you. However, there was an incident that occurred during my early incarceration in Auschwitz. It was a selection. I want you to know that in Auschwitz we work every day of the week, including Sundays. Only some national holidays will be the day without work. Otherwise, work every day. On this fateful day, however, we're told there'll be no work. Early in the morning, 2 officers of the SS that guarded the camp and number of soldiers came into our barracks and told us to strip naked and to form a line. When my time came in, I came in and stood in a military fashion because the Germans wanted us to act like soldiers. This was an army. We said, of course, I stood on attention, said, turn around. I turned around. He said, go to face me again. And he looked at me for a few seconds, said, right, go to the right. And then one of the soldiers says, you can get dressed. However, some of the prisoners that began to show the sign of malnutrition, maybe the ribs were showing, maybe the eyes were bulging, or maybe they were unsteady as they were approaching the officer, these were told to go to the left. Then right upon that, everybody in the camp had a number tattooed. My number is 171952. So one of the guards took the number down on a pallet and said, you can get dressed too. Another week passed by, same thing occurred. Today, no work. Again, early in the morning, soldiers came in, the guards came in into our barracks and start with the tablet of the numbers they've taken from a previous visit, and then start calling these prison numbers, told them to come towards the entrance of the barracks. A father of a very close friend of mine, somebody I've known for a long, long time, visited at their home. His number was called. He came by me, stopped for a few seconds and say, Severin, avenge my innocent death. Don't let the world forget what's happening to me today. I stood over there, moved with the emotion of the moment, and I says, yes, I will. Well, he was taken out of the barracks, and of course, he perished the same day. So when I survived the war and the camps, I wondered, how do I fulfill my pledge? Go and kill somebody? I couldn't do that, of course. It would make no sense. And this is when I decided that the only way I can avenge his innocent death and millions of others that died only because of the wrong religion, according to the German government, or wrong race, according to the German government, or maybe belong to the party that the government has not approved. All these innocent millions that died hopefully have not died in vain. There's nothing like we can do about bringing them back to life. It's true. The only thing we can do, making sure that something like this never happens again. So maybe I ought to start with the beginning. How did I get into the Auschwitz in the first place? I was born shortly after World War I in a newly created Poland. Poland, like many other countries in Europe, lost its independence, and they were occupied by various empires like Germany, Austria, and Russia. An area where I was born, Germany occupied good part of Poland. And so the population locally spoke Polish at home and German officially. After World War I, the victorious Allies decided to redraw the map of Europe and sort of restored the countries that did not exist before, and Poland was recreated as well. So when I went to school, of course, I spoke Polish as well, and in the streets we spoke German. When I was maybe 8, 9 years of age, my father hired a French teacher. French at that time was the language of the intelligentsia. Anyone that was truly educated spoke French. Just English is today. French was then this language every educated Pole ought to be speaking. When I went to high school, my father told me that I ought to be taking one of the Western languages. And there was 3 choices. Either German, French, or English. Since I spoke already these 3 languages, father said, well, why don't you take English? I want you to know that I really wasn't so happy about this. I said, I'm a young kid. I already speak 3 languages. He says, nope, you're not going to work hard enough. You take English. So, of course, obeying my father, I took English. And, it's sort of strange how things are in life. Would I know that for the rest of my life, that's the language I'll be speaking? And when you hear my story, too, it really saved my life. In high school, too, I joined the ROTC. ROTC in Poland, there was a compulsory military service for men. Once you finish high school, you had to go to the military. However, if during the high school years you were a member of ROTC, then you could apply to the officers' school. And I figured out, well, better be an officer than be an enlisted man, and that's the reason why I joined ROTC. When the World War II broke out in 1939, I felt, of course, duty-bound to join the Polish army. The Polish army, most unfortunately, was no match for the very well-oiled German war machine. All we had to do, or we could do, was keep on retreating. Polish army consisted of infantry, cavalry, very few tanks, very few planes, and of course Germans were highly mechanized, and of course you know who's going to win, who has tanks and mechanized equipment. So all we can do is keep on retreating and retreating from the onslaught of the German army. In the meantime, Russia declared war on Poland and entered it from the eastern border. So I was one day squeezed between the 2 armies. So one day our officer came to us, say, okay, boys, war's over for you. Take your sides, go to Russia or Germany. War is over for you. So I sold my rifle because I figured I needed something to eat. They didn't feed us. I went to a farm and sold my rifle and I went home. We had no uniforms. All I had is a little band, a white and red band with an eagle on it. So I removed the band and I went home. Of course, the home, I was born in Silesia. Silesia is sort of a southwestern part of Poland, very industrial, resembles sort of a western part of Pennsylvania, like Pittsburgh. It's coal mines and steel. I come from a family of blacksmiths. As a matter of my name, Fayerman, in German, when Germany occupied it, was Feuermann, comes from a man of fire. My family was always engaged in working with hot metals and, of course, fires. My grandfather was a blacksmith as well, and he was a very ingenious individual and ambitious, and he started a manufacturing operation, making bolts, screws, and hardware. When I returned back from the war, I found out that all schools were closed for Poles, and I could not continue my education. Then I asked my father, could he use me in the factory? And he said, yes, you can work for me. And he said, you can have a choice. Come and work with me in office and take my work at my side, or work with your grandfather. I made the best decision in my life. I said, I want to work with my grandfather. And my grandfather was very proud to kind of teach the only member of the young family still following the trade, and I became a blacksmith. After I've learned how to become a blacksmith, my grandfather said, you ought to become a tool maker. Tools are a heart of every hardware manufacturing company. Without the tools, you could not make any product. First, you've got to make tools, and then you can make the products. So he said, it would be important for you to learn how to do this important part of our manufacturing operation. I followed his advice and began to learn how to become a tool maker. In the meantime, changes occurred in our area. Hitler decided to incorporate back this part that for a long time was part of Germany back into Germany. So we as Poles sort of lost our rights that we had before and became aliens really in our own country. And also we were not allowed to operate the business as we did before as owners. We needed a German official to run the business. They didn't trust us. They felt that maybe we would do something maybe in wrong, and we were told that you need to get somebody that is of German descent. My father was pretty smart and was able to find one of our representatives who took the job of the supervisor, Germans called Treuhändler. Eventually, he passed away, and his relative, another cousin of his, took over this supervision. However, this cousin didn't know us well, and eventually feel that he becomes an enemy. He felt that he doesn't need us anymore. Now he is really the general manager, and he became berating us, yelling at us in front of the workers, and really we felt very uncomfortable. And things began to change during the war as well. America entered, in the meantime, the war in Europe, started bombarding and destroying so many cities in the western part of Germany. And Germans lost, of course, their property and their homes. And Hitler then decided to declare Germany Judenrein, free of Jews. And all the Jews were expelled from Poland. I don't know if you realize that before World War II, Poland had the largest Jewish population of any European country. In a country of about 33 million, over 6 million were Jews. And in many times, there was predominantly Jewish towns, were called shtetls. And in the town in where I was born, and where the factory was, Benzin, there were predominantly Jewish people. So once they were deported, the city became empty. So the German government decided to resettle all these people German people that lost their properties to the town in which we lived, which was far away from American planes. American planes never bombarded or destroyed that part of the country. So the Germans began to arrive. But you know how the Germans feel about the Jewish people, and they felt that these houses need to be renovated, repainted, and straightened out and made sort of livable for the Germans. So they needed labor. What they did in our town, as did in every larger city in Germany, they created a forced labor camp. What they actually did is took a part of suburbs, and it happened to be Kamionka, and then turned a barbed wire around a few houses, and then called it the camp. How to fill the camp? Very simply, what they did is closed busy streets during the busy hours of the day, and then ask people for their papers, Ausweis. Everybody had a document, identification papers. And if you were not a German or working in a war-important industry, you were simply arrested on the spot and taken to this camp. One Sunday morning, police knocked on our door. I lived with my father, my uncle, and my mother, and arrested our whole family. We assumed that was the job of this Treuhändler that wanted to get rid of us. They were arresting a lot of Polish people. If you that's a good way to get rid of them. I'm not sure, but that I think what has happened. Well, we're taken to that camp, and the work was not very difficult. We're supervised by police. The chief of police, the commandant of the camp, became very friendly. My father spoke German very well. He was blonde, blue eyes, and so he just kind of made him as his assistant. And we had a fairly decent life, sort of like Stalag 17. Most of the soldiers were like Schultz. And so we really sort of lived them in peace, and things were going well. But eventually we finished up cleaning the houses, and the job was done. And our commandant told my father, says, Henry, the job's done very well. However, I have no other work for you guys. I've got to move you to another camp. Once you're on our hands, you've got to stay there until the end of the war. So very unfortunately, the city of Benzin has been like 35 miles north of Auschwitz, and our whole camp was taken to Auschwitz. I don't think I will ever forget my first entry into Auschwitz. We were loaded in the cattle cars, and the train arrived at the siding in Auschwitz. Once we arrived there, the doors were flung open. were surrounded with soldiers with guns pointed at us. There were dogs, snarling dogs at their feet, and they started yelling at us. You know, German is a very beautiful language. Somehow these German guards had this gnarled, horrible sound, growl that sounded like an animal. We were so frightened. We walked out, of course, of the train, and then he said, separate women, separated from men. My mother went to stand with the women. I stood with my father and my uncle. And then there was an officer, not distant, motioning us to come to him and said, form the lines of 5. And so I stood with my family and 2 other individuals, and he was looking at us and says, go rechts or go left, go right or left. Older people and younger people, very young, were told to the left, or maybe people that were infirm, all go to the left. He said, wait here, the trucks will come and load you up. You wouldn't have to go. This healthy individual is going to have to march. You wait here, the trucks will get you. The trucks did come out later on, I found out, and the trucks went directly to the gas chambers. Only healthy individuals, men and women, were allowed to enter the camp. By the time all of this passed on, it became a little bit darker. It rained that day. Poland is a cold and wet country. And as we walked on the road, it was a slippery road. I remember on both sides there were barbed wires. There were towers in which soldiers stood with machine guns. In the distance, there were chimneys with a fire belching out of there. There is smell of human flesh in the air. If anyone can imagine a purgatory, this is what it must look like. Well, we walked all on the road and eventually came up to the main gate. And at the gate, they told us, it's too late for you guys to get into the camp. Tomorrow morning, you'll be indoctrinated. Tonight, you spend a room in one of the buildings. So I, again, remember my first night in Auschwitz. We laid in a building about the size of this canteen. I laid on the floor with my father. My father embraced me and said, you know, Severin, think of it. Bandits, robbers and murderers accosted us, caught us. They may kill us, they may not. If you ever survive, remember, we're all going to meet in Salzburg, where your grandmothers lived. I said, okay, Dad, I would do so if we survive. Early in the morning, we're awakened. I don't think, slept very much that night. And an officer came into the room. There was a table by the wall on which say, take all your money, all the watches, jewelry, and put it on the table. I had a wristwatch, and I had a billfold, which I left on the table. Then say, step to the next door and take your clothes off. I stripped naked, and there were prisoners standing over there with shaving equipment and shaved every hair on my body. Except for eyebrows and eyelashes, I was hairless. Then they tattooed a number of my left-hand arm, and I received a towel, piece of soap, and ushered into the showers. In the showers, we washed up and dried off, and then prison garb was given up. It consisted of underwear, pants and jacket in striped blue and gray, a round hat without a visor, a cup, a spoon, and a bowl. And with this, I was ushered into the camp. I was taken into a camp called a quarantine camp. The Germans wanted to test the ability of the prisoners to do hard work and with very little food. Who could not do it, couldn't keep his strength, was eliminated, as the selection I told you happened at the beginning of my presentation. We worked, I think maybe the best way to describe the life in Auschwitz, what was a day like in a prisoner in Auschwitz. We slept in long rectangular buildings on both sides. There were shelvings 3 high. In each shelving, 5 prisoners laid on wooden boards. There were just sacks on which we were sleeping, actually straw mattresses. Each prisoner received a blanket to cover ourselves. 5 prisoners lived very close to one another just to keep warm. In the morning, we awakened very early in the morning. It was still dark outside, went to the latrines, cleaned up, and then breakfast was served. Breakfast consisted of a lukewarm tea, actually herbal tea, no sugar. That's all for breakfast. With this, step outside and form working brigades. I was assigned to a brigade digging trenches. Why trenches were required? The crematoriums operated 24 hours a day, and there were a tremendous amount of ashes and human remains that didn't burn, which needed to be buried. So my job was to dig the trenches. So I walked out of the camp with a group of other prisoners, walked maybe half a mile or so from the edge of the camp, and start digging. For tools, all we had is shovels, wheelbarrows, and picks. We were surrounded by soldiers. We were on an open field, often rained, or was very cold, it snowed. We had to do all by hand, and something I have not been used to. I work in a factory, I stood on my feet most of the day, but I didn't do this. I didn't know how to do this, or I wasn't used to doing this heavy physical work. However, we were pushed, we were rushed, we had to do it, and of course I did the best I possibly could. We worked like this until about noontime. At noontime, a lunch was served. We had to bring the cauldrons of soup with us in the metal containers, and Poland being, as I said, a cold country, by noon, the soup was nearly cold. Very watery soup. I quickly realized not to be first in line. Also, I was very hungry, but I waited until about mid, so the size or half of the container was kind of already dished out, hopefully to find something in it. Otherwise, when you went up first and got the first dishing out, all it was plain water, just cold, little wet, kind of a greasy water. However, you wait a little bit, maybe you could find a turnip, maybe you can find something solid. That's all, one bowl of that soup, about 25, 30 minutes for break, back to work. And afternoons were worse. The guards were more nervous, sometimes they were wet, they were miserable, they hated doing that job, and the prisoners were tired as well. Many of them would just fall on the ground and lay because couldn't do it anymore. And we dragged ourselves for the whole afternoon. Then as dark became, back to the camp. Lay the tools down, march back to the camp. As we entered the camp, music would play, and we have marched in military fashion, like soldiers. We're counted as we entered the camp, and then back to the barracks. However, we were not allowed to enter the barracks until all the camps were counted. Auschwitz consisted of 4 large camps. Each one has tens of thousands of prisoners. So it took hours for this counting to take place. And many of these soldiers weren't very good mathematicians and made mistakes, so had to be recounted several times. It took hours, and it was one of the most miserable part of the day. The prisoners were wet, were tired, and most probably the worst part of the day was this counting. Eventually, the all clear sounded, a siren, go back to the barracks. Dinner was served. Dinner consisted every day of a 4-inch square of bread, wet, very unappetizing. One day there was a bit of margarine, the next day a spoon of jam, third day a piece of sausage. Regularly, that's all we've got. On this, you could not do the hard work the Germans wanted you to do and be able to survive and do the work as well. So how do you survive Auschwitz? How do you survive any of the camps? You must get more food. And that was called organizing. You went outside. The minute I devoured my dinner very hungrily, I looked out for extra work. How do you find extra work in Auschwitz? Well, not all prisoners were really treated equally. There were a number of prisoners that have been in a camp for a long time, and many of them were professionals. And these professionals were treated better. They didn't sleep on the shelvings. They had little cots separately, and they had double or triple rations because they were important to the camp. So I've realized these guys maybe need somebody that would be their servant. So I walked up to them and says, I could do anything. I could mend you socks. I would clean your place for a little bit extra food that you give me. So 2 or 3 of these guys hired me, and they gave me just a little bit more food that I could survive. However, a lucky thing occurred to me. Each one of the camp in which about 700 prisoners lived, there was always a German supervisor. Hitler emptied all the prisons and took all the criminals, whoever they were, and sent them to the concentration camps and made them supervisors, titled them capos. from the Latin word head. Couples wore different uniforms. They had dark blue uniforms, and they were dressed well. They had a separate little room in which they lived, and a bed to sleep in. And of course, as food is concerned, as soon as food was received to distribute it among the prisoners, they took whatever they wanted. And beside this, to Auschwitz, there were 1,100,000 people were gassed and cremated. And of course, as these people arrived to Auschwitz, they all thought that they were being resettled and brought with them food for the sausages, breads, hard-boiled eggs, or whatever they could, so they could survive during the trip, and hopefully when they arrived there, something for them to eat. Well, what happened, and once they arrived to Auschwitz, they were told to leave everything behind and step outside. They were processed into the camp, and all that they brought, all their belongings, were then taken in. Prisoners were sent into the trains and removed all those belongings. And the clothes were, of course, separated, sent to a separate building, but food was distributed among the capos and also factories that were built all around Auschwitz. Since there were so many prisoners, many German factories companies opened factories because they had labor, cheap labor. So this is where this food went. So our capo in our building received those wonderful sausages and all this good stuff. Sometimes fish, even smoked fish. And especially I remember when the Hungarian Jews were brought into our camp, there was just wonderful bread. I've never seen this delicious and beautiful bread. And there were salamis and all this good food. And of course, this couple had all this to eat. Well, this particular couple in our building had a wish. He wanted to learn how to speak English. Well, you wonder, why would a couple want to speak English? Well, he was sure Germany would be victorious. And he thought that he would be sent to a British concentration camp. And it behooved him to learn how to speak English, because then he could tell those Englishmen what to do. So he said, who can teach him English? Well, of course, I took English in high school. I figured, well, that's an opportunity. I applied. I don't know how it happened. He took me. I became his teacher. And that changed my life. The capo was a very influential individual. He was able to retain as many prisoners as he needed in the barracks to keep them clean. And he also was even allowed to leave the camp on his word. He walked up to the headquarters, says, I want to go to town. On his word, he was sent and came back, because it was better life in Auschwitz for him than outside. He had plenty to eat, he had no problems, and he didn't do any work, just directed other people. So I started teaching him English. Of course, he asked me, have you been to England? Are you English? I says, no, I'm Polish, but I speak English. Of course, I says, oh, yes, I speak English very well. All I had is about 2 or 3 years of English in high school. Of course, he didn't know the difference, fortunately. However, he told me, you don't have to go to work anymore. You stay here, you teach me. And he got a good outfit for me. I really regained my strengths. I started looking much better. And he got a special outfit made for me, got shoes for me. I just was in seventh heaven. However, another good thing occurred. Germany was winning many of the wars, but that came in at a cost. Many of the German soldiers did perish or wounded, so many of the companies began to lose their workers as well. So they came to Auschwitz and other camps looking for skilled labor. Siemens Electric Company, the company that you see the ads now in the papers often, this international electric company, came to Auschwitz looking for tool makers. Well, remember, I learned that trade. So they said there will be an examination, and who was wasting our time would be severely beaten, but who will pass it will be taken out and taken to a factory. I said, I don't think I will survive Auschwitz. I'm going to take my chances. So I applied. I went through examination, and lo and behold, I passed. And I was taken out of Auschwitz and sent to a factory. And really, most of you, why you are able to see me here standing in front of you is because I did not spend all my time in Auschwitz. I was taken to a factory. In the factory, we were treated very well. The food was supplied by the company, so we had plenty to eat. As a matter of fact, I want you to know that I have improved my skills as a toolmaker because Siemens was an international corporation, much more advanced tools that I have ever worked with, and I really became a better toolmaker. So I took advantage of my imprisonment by kind of honing on my skills. However, the war was slowly coming to an end. Russia broke through the Eastern Front and approached Auschwitz. So the German authorities took us out of Auschwitz and through a forced march, marched us to a railhead, and eventually I was transported to another camp called Buchenwald. Buchenwald was a camp in Western Germany. We traveled for maybe 10 days in open gondolas, 100 prisoners in each one of those, without food whatsoever. By the time we arrived to Buchenwald, maybe 10% of prisoners survived in it. All wagons were filled with dead bodies. And eventually, I and others, of course, walked out of it and entered the camp. Buchenwald was a big forced labor camp. Actually, it was a quarry. There was very dangerous work in a quarry, many accidents every day. Many prisoners were killed or injured in accidents. But another lucky thing occurred. America, by that time, American planes were beginning to destroy so many cities nearby that they needed help to go send prisoners to those cities to clear the roads from all the rubble that remained after bombardment. So since I was one of the newcomers, rather than send me to the quarry, I was put on the trains and every day sent to another city in which we were clearing rubble. We were not supervised very well, of course. In a camp, if you're not supervised, you don't work. So we worked as little as we possibly could, and what we were looking for is additional food, because the only way you could survive a concentration camp is get additional food. However, not all buildings were completely destroyed, so we climbed through the ruins and worked in various kitchens, and we found still food here and there. Some of the Germans, even seeing our terrible state, would leave some food between the ruins, and somehow I was managing to survive. You know how German companies are well organized, so is Siemens, and they were able to trace me to Buchenwald and had me transferred from Buchenwald to Berlin. I went to Berlin and worked in the headquarters. The headquarters of companies are in part of Berlin called Siemensstadt. It was a huge complex, maybe 5-6 city blocks. We had a camp, of course, a forced labor camp, into which I was sent and walked to work every day. I was assigned to a second shift as a toolmaker, worked in a huge, large building. By this time, I want you to know, the Americans had a complete superiority of the air over Berlin. Every day you could wind your watch. At 10:30 in the morning, the American planes would come up, drop their bombs, and destroy the city. Berlin ceased to exist little by little, was nothing but burned out shells. At night, the British night bombers would come and do the same thing, day in and day out. It actually became so that by, like, say, 10:30, 10:45, one of our foremen would come around and say, okay, boys, lock up all your toolboxes. The British will be here any day, any moment. Get ready to get to the shelters. Of course, there were shelters provided for the civilians, and we used those same company shelters. Well, one night, the British night boys did come in, apparently with express idea of destroying Siemens. And they did an unbelievable job. You know, sometimes you see it in the movies and you think this is made up. I don't think there were a few stones left on top of one another. The company ceased to exist. Well, of course, I lost my job. I survived as you can well understand. I survived the bombardment, and that's no fun. Being in those shelters, really the earth shakes, so the person moves with the earth. It's an unbelievable feeling. However, nothing happened to us. All cleared up. We sounded. We walked out, and there were burning ruins. We marched back to it was night, of course, to the barracks in which we lived, the camp. Again, I don't think I can forget it. Everything was burning. As we walked in the middle of the street, you saw German people running out and say, oh my God, look what happened, because they destroyed many buildings around the factory as well. And we were kind of a big smirk on our faces as they're getting in. So eventually we got back to the camp, of course, no job. We just said, see what happened. Well, they didn't have anything for us to do. They just fed us. However, by this time, again, the American planes had a complete superiority over Berlin. They didn't sound anymore any alarms. The planes arrived and disappeared, on and on. The Americans were very close, were on the side of Elbe River, and they were constantly flying over Berlin. One day, they came over our camp. There were trenches, open trenches for the prisoners to go in case of bombardment. So when the planes arrived over there, start dropping bombs. They were incendiary bombs. We ran into the shelters. Well, they burned the camp completely down. There was nothing left. It was made of wood, so burned very well. Few minutes later, smaller American planes came in. And I want you to know again, I consider this near a miracle. The unbelievable marksmanship and the flying control of the American pilots was unbelievable. Smaller planes flew over our camp, circled it a few times, and lowered themselves. And then, as prisoners, of course, were all in the shelters, and the guards were in the towers, start shooting up the towers. And unbelievable. Over 1,000 prisoners were in the shelters. Not a single prisoner was killed. And most of the guards were either dead or wounded. Unbelievable. A true unbelievable miracle. Well, of course, I could have escaped, but I was in the middle of Berlin, bombed out. I have no money, no hair, tattoo on my arms. I don't know anybody. I said, I'll wait what happens. Well, an hour later, police came in, rounded us up, and sent me to my last camp. My last camp was Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen was a camp in Berlin, on the outskirts of Berlin, sort of a special camp. It was a very unusual camp. You'll be surprised to hear maybe that the majority of people in Sachsenhausen were Germans. There were also in it a lot of high-ranking officers and officials of the countries that Germany has conquered. Presidents, prime ministers, secretaries of state, all these important people. Jacob Stalin, who was a son of Joseph Stalin, he was a general in the Russian army. He was captured. He was there. A lot of important people. But above all, clergymen. There were, of course, blocks and blocks of German clergymen. So already Germans imprisoned, the German government imprisoned many of their own citizens. And another thing occurred. Every morning, a number of civilians, men and women, came in from Berlin, were brought in Berlin by police, and they were stood by the front, near the front entrance of the camp. They painted their body with black paint, and then they put a big white sign, Ich bin ein Verbrecher, I am a criminal. And then stood them all day long, so everybody could see them during the day. That's who they were. At the end of the day, they lined up against the wall and shot them. It was just unbelievable experience. However, again, there was no work. And we began to start hearing, however, news. So it's the only camp in which I was, in which the German allowed us to hear the news. Of course, we heard only the report of the German army. And we, every day, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 4:30, we went to listen what the news are. And of course, we tried to deduce, what do they mean? What are they saying? And every day they were saying this. Today, the German army, our victorious German army, occupied a very advantageous position. So we said, they must be retreating. Every day there were better and more advantageous positions. Well, then later on, we started hearing some bombardment, artillery bombardment. Russia troops were approaching Berlin. So again, they gathered us in a good old merry way and marched us out of Berlin. We were found out that our destination was supposed to be Norway. They wanted to send us to Norway. Why Norway? It's because the German army was disintegrating, and their last, so to say, groups or divisions were to escape to Norway and fight to the very end. We were to dig the trenches for them, and they would die for the Vaterland in Valhalla. So this was the plan. Well, as we marched up north from Berlin, we begin to feel the wars coming to an end. You just get that feeling. On the side of the road, there were pieces of equipment. They were rucksacks, and we realized the pieces of uniform. As we walked through various villages, we saw the kind of a frightened faces of people looking at us as we were going by. As we walked down through the roads, often the American planes, small planes, will lower themselves, check us out, and fly away. The guards will mix with us because we were the shields for them. And we just kept on walking. They gave us no food. Eventually, the SS guards that guarded us disappeared. Young German boys with rifles bigger than they were guarding us, as frightened as we were, not knowing what's going on. We walked all day, no food, no water. At night, they took us into various little forests, and that's where we slept on the ground. We laid out blankets, just 3 or 4 fellows, wrapped ourselves in the blankets, and we slept on the ground, wet. It was April in northern Germany. It's cold. And we just kept progressing day upon day. And one day, again, another miracle occurred. Unbelievable. As we were getting set for bedding down, you might say, one of the forests, Red Cross trucks came in. American Red Cross came to our rescue. Unbelievable. How they ever crossed the German lines and found us in the middle of North, I will never understand. I want you to know that I am a director of the local Red Cross chapter, because I just consider this absolutely a miracle. The only food we ever received. Of course, they have with them K rations. That's the only thing that was available for the army. And the German guards opened each one of the boxes on the packages, took out chocolate, cigarettes, the good stuff, and each one, a prisoner, received one item. I happened to receive powdered milk. That's the only, I never seen powdered milk. You try to eat powdered milk, you find out that isn't that good. So anyway, but that's the only food we have received. My last night of imprisonment occurred in a quarry. That night, instead of into a forest, they put us in a big quarry. They surrounded us with machine guns, and we slept there with the usual method on the ground. I woke up in the morning, looked around, and I said that, hey, there's much fewer guards there were last night. So I climbed up to it. I speak German fluently. So I asked one of the Germans, was ist los? Where's everybody gone? And they said, oh, the Americans are coming. You can go. Well, he didn't have to say it twice. I ran down, told my guys, said, hey, let's get out of here before they change their mind. So we climbed down out of this quarry, and I approached these a few soldiers, said, where are the Americans? Which direction? Said, this direction. That's where they're coming from. So we walked up. Of course, it was a beautiful day. Again, one I won't forget. It was April, it was warm and beautiful, and I couldn't believe that I'm free, And I said to my friends, let's move faster, because they can change their minds and put us back in a prison. But nothing happened. We came across a kitchen that the Germans abandoned, and there was a pea soup in it. And I tell you, I filled up on that pea soup. As it was the first time I could really get my stomach full of food, and we continue walking. At the end of the day, we were tired, and I've seen an unfamiliar tank and a soldier I've never seen. There was the GI standing in the middle of the road, blocking the traffic, and we approached him. He looked at us and just waved us across the tank. I was saved by American Army that was rushing along the North Sea to intercept the places from which the Germans were shooting the V-bombs. Germans developed at the end of the war the famous V1 up to V about 9 or 11. And these were actually rockets which were indestructible. Once they were shot, they flew in the direction of England, and then the motor would stop, the bomb would drop and destroy a huge area. Since there was no way of stopping them, this is why the army was rushing and trying to intercept the areas from which they were launched. Since Americans have the superiority of the air, the Germans pull those rockets into the woods, and then at night, of course, put them out. And so there was no other way but actually occupying the area. And that's how I was liberated. As soon as we were on the other side of it, many other prisoners were coming in from the countryside. And 2 American officers came by and said, okay, wait, boys, we're going to get a truck for you, and we'll take you to a detention center. It was very close to the North Sea, so eventually I never got into, to Norway. However, the first I wasn't in the head of the column. I was within the middle of the column that was marching from Berlin to the North Sea. The head of the column was able to get to the sea, and they were loaded on ships, and the ships took off toward the direction of Norway. When American planes noticed what was happening, they radioed them to return back to the port, which they refused to do. So unfortunately, they had to torpedo them, and all these prisoners all drowned in these ships. Day upon days, bodies were floating out of these ships. It was a terrible thing. Fortunately, I escaped that by not being in the head of that group. Well, they sent us to a submarine school, which was converted into a camp supervised by the United Nations. I speak fluently 5 languages, so I asked them if they could use me as interpreter, since all these various people came from different parts of Europe. Actually, it was like a League of Nations. There were Belgians, there were French, there were Dutch, there were Poles, there were Russians, Yugoslavs. All were represented, and it had to be sorted out, and the United Nations notified these various countries. They have their citizens. Please send equipment and take them back. So I eventually started working for the Americans. I wanted to improve my English. That's a good opportunity to work for the Americans. And eventually I got myself a job as a registrar. So as news came on, I always kept those notes and posted whatever information required. There was no connection, there was no radio, no telephone, no communication. The only thing is that each camp there was a person from United Nations. Went from camp to camp, and he gathered the names and then posted them in other camps so the prisoners would know that, hey, somebody who survived in your family. Well, while I received those notes and posted them, I noticed one day a name, Severin Fayerman. I said, wow, that's my uncle. I said, somebody survived. Then I remember when my father told me, you should go to Salzburg. So I asked the commandant, would he give me permission to leave, and some letters of recommendation. So eventually it was a letter of recommendation, a small little suitcase. I stepped out of the camp. Well, there was no transportation, nothing, except American trucks and some civilian going up and down. So I hitchhiked. And of course, you know the good heart of the Americans. One of the trucks stopped. They says, where you want to go? I said, I want to go to Austria. I says, I'm going in that direction, and I'll take you part way. And so he kept passing me from one to another. And eventually, I did get into Austria. But he said, look, I can take you through. You've got to do it on your own before the border. Austria declared itself an independent country, and American military personnel was guarding the borders. So as I left the truck and walked up to the post, to the border gate, they asked me, where are you going to go? I said, I want to go to Salzburg. They said, who are you? I said, I was in a concentration camp. I'm a Pole. I'm from Poland. If you're not an Austrian, you can come in. I says, well, my family is over there. I pleaded, says, can I see you, commanding officer? Yes, you can. Talked with him. So, the commanding officer, same thing. You can come in. If you're not an Austrian, you cannot come in. So I was desperate, but however, I could do nothing about it. I walked back, and there was a little town, small kind of buildings, a few buildings where farmers were living. And I walked up and, again, speak German, and I told them what's happening. And the Americans won't let me come to Austria. He says, don't worry, you don't know the Americans. You say, you wait here, we'll give you dinner. Tomorrow morning, I'll take you across. So in the morning, he gave me breakfast and took me with me. He says, and took me to the same way I came. He says, hey, they won't let me in. I know, these big guys stopped me. He said, do you see that road around this? Yeah. He says, go on that road. They won't bother you. So I stepped on the road, walked around the post, and literally I was in Austria. Eventually I did get to Salzburg, but I forgot where my grandmother lives. So I went to the police. I said, can you direct me? He said, well, you have to go to the Office of Prisoners of War. And that wasn't very far from there. I went to the Office of Prisoners of War, and there was a big room in which one gentleman was sitting behind the desk. I walked up, I spoke German, and I told him who I am, and I'm looking for my grandmother that lived in Parsh. And he didn't say anything to me. He just looked at me, and I didn't understand me, so I repeated it. He came around me, stood for a minute here, and says, you know, you're the first person I can tell that the whole family is here. Your father, your mother, your uncle, asking about you every day. I know where your grandmother is. Hop in, I'll take you there. Unbelievable. My whole family survived it. Can you believe it? Unscarce, nothing, no problem, just perfect. So, my father, you can imagine the reunion, especially when my mother saw me. She couldn't believe it. I was the last member that returned back from the family. They thought I perished. So my father went back to Poland and thought if he could maybe get the factory that, of course, we owned. The Polish government was communist at that time, influenced by Russians, and said, no, there is no private ownership. You can work here as an employee, but you cannot be the owner. His friends told him, you know, Henry, that's dangerous for you. I think you better leave. So my father came back to Salzburg and said, well, we have no other, we have to emigrate. Well, since I was idle in Salzburg, and I said, maybe I'll go back to the United Nations so I get a job. I was employed by the United Nations, eventually got a uniform. I got a British uniform because Polish army was fighting on the side of the British. So with dressed in a uniform, I was sent to Vienna, where I work as an interpreter. And eventually, by that time, I've heard that President Truman made possible for displaced persons to come to America. So I applied, and they said, do you have a family? I says, yes. He says, we want families together. So we went through examination, and we passed the examination, and I said to the officer, I'd like to be on the first ship coming to America. He says, you can't, only orphans. Since you're not an orphan, you wait for the second ship. Well, I came on the second ship. And again, you know, you realize only this happens in America. Which country would do that? They fed us, they treated us well, they transported us, and brought us on a troop ship that was named Marine Purge. And the ship arrived to the city of New York. I passed the Statue of Liberty. And eventually, the immigration people got on board. And since I had no papers, gave me a piece of paper in lieu of passport, $20, and a handshake said, welcome to a new country. So with this, we landed on the west side of New York with $80. Well, I anticipated that when I come here, what do we do as we come to America? So I asked my supervisors in Austria, give me a letter of recommendation to somebody who could help us. So they gave me a letter to the Traveler's Aid. I went to the Office of Traveler's Aid with a letter, and they told me, yes, we'll put you for a hotel for 1 week. We'll pay for 1 week. So we settled ourselves on Broadway, when there was a number of hotels on Broadway. And again, we walked down, after we checked into the room, we walked outside, and our first walk on Broadway, you can imagine, looking at all these beautiful displays and food laid out. We couldn't believe it, all this fruit and all laid out. And we were very, of course, hungry. So my father said, let's buy a pineapple. Why pineapple? Because I've never seen a raw pineapple. It was the first time. So we bought this pineapple. It was $20 that we had. And went upstairs and cut it. So the first food in America was a fresh pineapple, which we've never eaten before. Well, and within a week, we were all able to get a job. By that time, employment was very high. We still were at war with Japan. So I went to unemployment office, and within a week, I got a job as a toolmaker in downtown New York. My father had a friend who was in the Polish embassy, so he had a job with the United Nations, Polish delegation to the United Nations. My uncle got a job as an engineer on Long Island, and I was able to find an apartment, a 5th floor, no elevator in the Bronx, and we started our life in America. The year was 1946. When we began our life here. In the fall of that year, my father turned to me one day after dinner and said, Severin, this is a wonderful country. We ought to start our lives all over again. Since you are best versed in English, you speak English the best of us, why don't you quit your job, see if you can buy a company? Well, I obeyed my father, and I started looking through the New York Times for ads. I looked at a few factories in New York. It wasn't something we really were interested or liked. Then one day, I saw an ad, Baldwin Tool and Die in Newark, New Jersey for sale. I took the train to New Jersey and met the owner. The owner was of German descent. His name was Ernst Horn, heavy German accent you can slice. And of course, I kind of say, well, I'm partly German. Not exactly true, but, schmoozed it in and started negotiating with him. And I brought my father to help the negotiation, who was better in German than I was. And eventually he says, how much do you want? He said, I want $20,000. Well, we didn't have $20,000. We were able to accumulate by this time $6,000. So we said, okay, what we'll do, we need to start with something. We'll give you $5,000, and then we have to start with something, and then each month we'll pay you a small sum of money until the debt is paid. He agreed to it, and so on January 2nd, 1947, we opened the doors with $1,000. I want you to know the rest of it, as you heard today, is a story of American dream. This company were able to build to an international corporation with sales now of hundreds of millions of dollars. Our hardware is all over the world. Our hardware is in the White House. Every president of the United States, when they leave the White House, builds a new residence. Baldwin always goes on it. We have been in one of the most prestigious buildings, not only in the United States, but also abroad. So as you can see from the very sad story that started in a concentration camp, it ended happily. It's a happy ending in America. I want you to know that this can happen in no other country in the world than this blessed country, America. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you so much. I like standing ovations. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will be happy to answer any questions you may have. That's kind of some of the proceedings.
If you could please raise your hand, I'll come to you with the microphone.
I very much enjoyed your presentation. I am not surprised in any way that you survived. Your energy, your inquisitiveness, your sense of humor, obviously did you well. And 4 to 5 languages. I have a son who's 22. I'm worried about King's English with him. Amazing. You glossed over somewhat the capo at Auschwitz, and I do not know the years that you were there, but the little bit that I hear, there were not many good ones. And so how did you perceive him, and how did he treat everyone else? And when exactly were you at Auschwitz?
At Auschwitz, very good question. I got to Auschwitz in 1942. I was in Auschwitz a short time because I was taken to the company later on, but all my imprisonment was a little bit under 2 years. And I was, of course, liberated by the Americans. So my period was about less than 2 years. Often I've been also asked, how do you survive? How do you survive something as horrible as Auschwitz, where millions of people, died? And the answer to it is simply that 3 major attributes of my survival. Number one, I was educated, and so I strongly believe in education and support it so strongly. Secondly, I spoke languages, and that was so important, especially I spoke German well, because I could communicate with the guards, and the guards often treated me better because I used me as an interpreter to many other prisoners, as there were, of course, all nationalities mixed there. And thirdly, the most important thing, I had a trade. I have been a tool and die maker, and of course, I was useful. If I wouldn't have been useful, if I wouldn't have been taken to a company, I would have not survived. And that's what I am actually now a public speaker. I speak at many high schools, usually educational facilities, and I stress so much among our young people the importance of speaking another language, which is definitely Spanish, which I recommend highly, and of course learning a trade, because if you have any trade, you could survive. And in Auschwitz, there were people that were cooks, for example, survived, tailors, shoemakers, anybody that was able to do some kind of work had been able to survive. Yep. Any other question? Yep.
The capo?
capo.
She was asking you about that particular capo that you
Was he a good capo?
was a friend of yours, or you became friendly with him.
The capo, good. The capo actually was he was a petty thief. I found later on. This became very nice fellow, and we got along very well. I want you to know what happened with the capos. Most of the capos were hated because many of them were criminals and have very bad, of course, tempers that were took it out of the prisoners that couldn't defend themselves. So in the very end, when the prisoners were leaving, some of the capos were remained behind because they were afraid maybe to mix. I don't know why, but some of the prisoners crept back into the camp and killed them. Majority of these capos were killed by the prisoners. They stoned them to death. There was a terrific hatred of the capos. The capo that befriended me, was good to me, yes, of course, and I wasn't there in Auschwitz. Eventually, at the end of the war, when I was leaving Auschwitz, I was working for the Siemens company, and I didn't walk out of Auschwitz. I walked out of the company. Yeah. Any other questions?
Here in the very back.
Could you say a word about your family? Because you said your mother, your father, and your uncle all survived.
Yes.
How did they manage to survive?
Very good question. How did they manage that? Of course, as I told you, as we came to the camp, my mother was separated. She actually, one of these most courageous, again, hooray for women, I would say. She was fortunate to get to work in a munition factory and became an operator, a machine operator. As I mentioned before, German companies built factories nearby because of the free labor. They didn't have to pay anything for labor, as the camp was feeding them, the employees, and maybe they pay a small amount, I don't know. But she worked on that factory and was treated very well. She's the only member of the family that escaped. My mother was taken, as I was marching up in the same time, as the camps were emptied, she was taken out and went march with the same group of prisoners that I was in. However, men who had to march all day and at night sometimes less in the forest, women were treated a little bit better. Women were taken in buildings and spent the night in buildings. So one night, my mother was taken into on a farm, into a shed. And this one had straw in it. All the prisoners women were pushed into it, packed in it, and in the morning gates were open, just everybody out. Germans who didn't count anymore. They were very nervous, realizing the Russians are getting very close to it. And my mother and her friend were smart enough to dig a hole in this straw and hid and waited till everybody left. When all was quiet, she walked out and started looking for the farmer that owns that farm. And it happened to be, this was Poland. Of course, she spoke Polish perfectly, and she told him that she came out, met him, and said, look, I'm a prisoner. Of course, he could see from the clothes she had and no hair, because women had the hair cut as well. And she said, if you save me, if you keep me here, I have hidden a ring on my body, and I'll give it to you when we are liberated. And he says, yes. So he gave her some food, and 3 days later, Russians came into this village, and she was liberated by the Russians. So she was the only member that really escaped. She went back to Benjin, where we live. Of course, nobody was there. She was the first one to return that town. And eventually, my father came there, and that's where they met. My father and my uncle. Very shortly after I came into, we were in Auschwitz in that quarantine camp. An announcement came in looking for printers, engravers, engineers, mechanics. My father was a bookkeeper. My uncle was an engineer, and they applied. Any prisoners heard something, jobs, they applied. Very shortly after, a week or later, my father, as I was ready to go to work, said, Severin, I'm going to stay behind in here. We're told they're going to be sent to another camp. I'm sorry to leave you here. You know, God bless you, kissed me, and said, hope to see you after the war. Well, that was it. I really lost news of him. However, when I was at Siemens, an incident occurred, then I found out where my father was. This is what happened. As I was working on the bench one day, and a soldier came by, touched my shoulder, says, "Come with me." So I went, followed him, took me to the main office, which was a distance away, and shoved me into one of the rooms in which there were 2 SS men and our commandant standing by the desk. And on the desk, there was a letter. And I stood at attention and said I was, sent, reported as ordered. And they said, "There's a letter for you, read it." I opened the letter. It was open, of course. I opened it and said, "This is from my father." It says, "Dear Severin, I'm so happy to tell you that Simon and I are in a very good camp. We're doing very well. I hope that your mother is well as well. Do you see her? Do you know anything about her? I hope to see you after the war, your loving father, Henry." I was delighted. My goodness. So my father said, so I folded the letter and gave it back to the officers and smiled and thanked them for it. They walked up and said, "Take that smile off your face," slapped me by the face. "This is not Chicago." I don't know why. This is Chicago. Gangsters. They're not gangsters of Chicago. This is not Chicago. And he says, "How did you know your father is here?" A big question. Says, "Well, my father came here. He had a similar number to mine. And it was addressed not to my name, because nobody had the name in Auschwitz. It was just a number. And how about your mother? Do you know where?" Which I did know where my mother is. It's another story. I wrote a book, as you know, in my life, and that you would find in it a lot of stories how I was able to communicate with my mother. But I said, "No, of course I said, I don't know where she is. I don't know anything about this." He said, "You're lying. Turn around." And they started beating me. And I said, from the beginning, I want to be a hero. You see in the movies, you bite your teeth and let them flog you. Well, after 5 or 10 whips, it hurts. So I started yelling, and eventually I figured, this guy's going to kill me here. So I pretended that I fainted. I dropped to the ground, and I say, "May God be the witness I'm telling the truth." Well, this guy, they listened to what I'm saying, and then they poured some coffee over me. It was cold, fortunately. So, "You're lying, you dog, get out." Well, so anyway, this way, I found out that my father is there. Eventually, it's a long story. I don't have enough time to tell you, but I eventually did find out that my father was in Auschwitz. Here's the true story, what happened to him. He and my uncle and numbers of others were sent to Sachsenhausen, same camp in which I ended. By the time I came to Sachsenhausen, he was gone. He was taken into a special camp within a camp. In Sachsenhausen, the Germans created a secret camp. There's a movie about it called The Counterfeiters. It's a story of the camp in which my father was imprisoned. They were actually falsifying documents, and the major occupation of it was printing American dollars. Heinrich Himmler, who was the right hand of Hitler, had an idea that he wanted to flood the market with falsified American dollars. This way, it would destroy the confidence that the world had in the dollars, and that would affect most probably adversely our effort on fighting them. And that was the idea. So, hence the engravers and the printers. My father said they're beautiful. The dollars look wonderful. The only problem, the paper wasn't good. So here was every week they were sending different papers and they were testing it. Nothing worked. They had the Altmacherei. People were sitting over there folding the paper and straightening the banknote. Nothing worked. So they gave up. They decided to print British money. I don't know if you remember that before World War II, there was a £5 note, £5 sterling note, white tissue paper, easy to duplicate, and that's what they were printing. Millions and millions of those pound notes. However, they couldn't dump them because people weren't sure if England will win the war. There was still fighting going on. The people thought England may lose, so they didn't want to accept the £5 notes. So you know what they did with the Germans? They paid the spies with them. And remarkably, during World War I, the German spy system was one of the best in the world. And World War II was the worst. And the problem was they paid the spies with false money, and they got false information for it. So that's what happened. Eventually, the camp, when I came to Sachsenhausen, the camp was moved close to the Swiss border. Then when the 42nd Division approached the camp, the fellows that managed and did all the printing and all this, they escaped to Switzerland. and the camp was taken over by the soldiers, by the police, and they said, let them free. So my father was freed by the 42nd Division, and that's how he survived. And they, of course, all went to Salzburg waiting for me, and of course I eventually got there. So that's how they miraculously. Father was very well treated. They were giving good food. So this is how everybody of the family survived. Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Yes.
One in the back corner.
His question was answered.
I would have one question, sir. Are there ever reunions of people who were in the camps?
I beg your pardon. What was the question?
Are there reunions of survivors of the camps?
No. I want you to know there were none. I think that once people were liberated, they're scattered all over. And when I came on a ship, of course, which are all displaced persons, and many of them survivors, of course, of the camps, here in America, on the beginning, I had some contact with them in New York. But soon these people found either relatives or friends and moved all over the country. And another thing, remember I told you in the very beginning, I wanted so very much to become one of you, an American. I didn't want to have anything to do with these guys anymore. I said, I'm an American here now, and I just have not maintained any contact or reunion. Yep. Any other?
Last question.
Yes.
We've read that the Russians committed atrocities against the Polish officers.
Yes.
After the battle for Poland. Was there ever an issue with you and your relationships with the Germans as you were going through this process of, retreating back to the homeland and then unfortunately ending up in these camps where your status as a Polish army officer did that become a huge liability for you through that time?
I tell you, very, very sad. The camp's name was Katyn. The Russians kept most of the officers in Offlag. And they kept them separate because the Russians too feared the intelligentsia. Usually, Poland had a large number of people that were uneducated. There was 30 or 35% of population didn't know how to read and write. And they could be easily led. It's the intelligentsia that they feared. The professor of the universities, a priest, these are the people they didn't like, and officers as well. So they kept those officers in a camp called Katyn. Since you may not realize it, but among many European countries, there always were hatreds. Poles hated Russians and hated Germans because in the history of the country, there were nothing but wars. When I went to school, all I learned is about a war, one war followed the other. And you get an inbred hatred of your neighbor because of these various atrocities they have performed. And the Russians disliked Poles immensely. One day, they took all these officers from Katyn into the forest and shot them and killed them. So when eventually war was over then, and Germans occupied that area, found these various dead bodies. And of course the Russians then blamed the Germans for it, said when the Germans came in, they killed them. And that's what the Poles were saying, no, this is not true. We have other proofs that actually the Russians killed them, and they denied that this is not true. It's typical of the communist system. They are the unbelievable liars. Well, when perestroika came in, eventually they admitted, we did it. And actually it's the Russians that killed the Poles. But, what is, I think, so sad about this entire situation, that it is sort of swept under the carpet. Nobody was prosecuted. Nobody was brought to justice. Not like the Nuremberg trials that our country has wonderfully arranged, proving that actually the Germans have committed it. There was a trial, and they were convicted as criminals. Nothing like this happened. Just say, yes, sorry, we did it. That's the end of it. But I'm sure the people that committed the crime still were around. And that is so typical of other countries. It's so different how America looked at it, at so to say, executing justice. Okay. Thank you very much again.
Mr. Fayerman.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you.